Fear, tragedy, confusion, and anger. The terrorist attack that occurred on September 11, 2001 shook millions of people and killed thousands. I think it's the biggest massacre to ever occur if you discount wars, invasions, and sackings of cities in the old days. And 9/11 didn't just shake up America, the tragedy could be felt globally. I was 7 years old when it happened, and I remember the teachers bringing everyone to the gym hall to light candles and hold a silent minute. This was in Sweden. I remember the confusion and the fear, the sadness of it all. I understand the hatred and anger some felt after the attack on the Twin Towers. The attack was basically a declaration of war coming from Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, but rage can be blinding. Especially if it's growing inside a stupid person, a person with no inhibitions. That is where we get to Mark Stroman, a self-proclaimed white supremacist and patriot. He had been locked up before and spent time with the Aryan Brotherhood. He was already full of hatred, but now the rage was invading his thoughts. He was very angry with the American government as well. He didn't see them act on what he thought needed to be done, which was to exterminate every citizen with Middle Eastern descent. I'm sure other people, more rational people, felt the same way at the time simply because of the shock the whole event produced. Those people may have thought it then, and honestly, there isn't really anything wrong with just thinking stuff. The issue arises when you begin to act on those thoughts. That is what Mark Stroman did. He had committed crimes before, but nothing like this. September 11, 2001 came and things changed. Not only emotionally for those affected, but regulations were made. Security changed and became what we have today, 18 years later. Mark Stroman was fuming. He looked at the carnage around him, the mourning and the fear, and he also saw his government. In his eyes, they were doing nothing. They were not doing their patriotic duty, and if they weren't going to do something about it, then he sure was going to. His spree of revenge and violence began on September 15, 2001, far away from New York in Texas, the state that executes more criminals than any other. Smart move, Mark. Waqar Hassan was grilling hamburgers in his Dallas store when Mark Stroman walked in. What Mark didn't know was that Waqar Hassan wasn't really Middle Eastern. He was from Pakistan. He came from an area located on the Indian subcontinent. But that didn't matter to Mark. He just walked in and shot Hassan right in the forehead. One bullet, one squeeze of the finger, and a life had been taken. All of Mark Stroman's victims came from South Asia. I do imagine it would be like wanting revenge for World War II, but instead of killing Germans, you killed Danish people. Only 6 days went by when Stroman decided to commit his second murder. If he had been successful in killing Raisuddin Buyoyan that day, then he would have been classified as a serial killer today. Because he didn't manage to kill Raisuddin. He shot him and wounded him, but the store clerk survived the attack. The irony there though is that when Stroman had been caught and was sitting on death row, Raisuddin became an active fighter to save his life. Raisuddin forgave Stroman and did everything he could to save his attacker's life. That's a very honorable thing to do. I would have wanted to inject the guy myself. So Raisuddin survived the shooting, but Hassar had died. Mark Stroman still had one crime to commit though, before he was caught. It was now October 4th, 2001, and Mark entered a gas station where 49-year-old Vasudev Patel was working. Mark had been there before, checking the store out, planning to further his quest for vengeance. It was still morning when Stroman walked into the gas station. This time he did things differently though. There was no robbery involved in his previous attacks, but this time he raised his gun at Patel and demanded that he gave him money. Patel kept a .22 caliber gun under his desk, but for some reason he wasn't able to retrieve it. It would have been too late anyway, as Mark at that point pulled the trigger and shot Patel right in the chest. Patel fell to the floor, and Mark Stroman walked around and tried to open the register. He couldn't get it open though, and so he began shouting at the dying man on the floor, shouting to open the register, but Patel had already begun sinking into the void, and Mark left. The entire scene that had transpired was caught on camera. Apparently Mark had no idea that there was security cameras. Mark was caught and sentenced to death. He at some point changed his views and his ways as he began having a correspondence with the man he had tried to kill, Raisuddin, but it didn't help. Maybe in another state it could have helped, but the dumbass committed the worst crime you can commit twice in the state that executes more prisoners than any other. It took a while, but on July 20, 2011, Mark Stroman was strapped to the table and injected with a healthy dose of death. Frank Masini had immigrated to America from Italy when he was 17 years old. There he moved to New Jersey and set up a business for himself. He was a carpenter, and for many years he lived a normal working man's life. But there was something wrong with Frank. There was no signs of it. Usually there is at least some childhood incidents, some trauma or just bizarre behavior to trace back to, but Frank seems to have been just a regular Joe up until 1991. At that point he was 48 years old, happily married, he had kids and no issues with neither alcohol nor drugs, and no previous criminal behavior. But something happened in 1991. Something made that barrier he had in his head crumble, because the things that he did doesn't just happen like that. He must have had thoughts at least, thoughts he suppressed, thoughts that he kept buried away for as long as he could. He wasn't like Ed Kemper, for example. Ed Kemper grew up with his thoughts. It was in a twisted and dark way a natural progression for him. But Frank refused that side of himself. He didn't want to have anything to do with it, but by suppressing it and ignoring it, he just postponed the inevitable explosion. And that explosion came when Frank in 1991 walked into the home of his 85-year-old aunt, Anna Masini, an older relative. He had gone inside to use her telephone that day. Anna gave Frank a soda to drink, and he finished the glass and went to wash it out in the sink. But as he was standing there with the water running, he saw a knife laying on the counter. And for some reason, he picked the knife up and walked to his aunt. He began stabbing her numerous times, mostly aiming for her neck. It wasn't a way overkill, but as he stopped stabbing his old aunt, he noticed a tent in his pants. He had felt detached during the attack, as if he wasn't even there. The barrier had broken. Once Anna Masini lay dead, Frank got on top of her and raped her corpse, both vaginally and anally. He must have felt confused afterwards. He had never done anything like that before, and it had been so random. He had no idea that the Levies was about to break, and the murder of Aunt Anna was only his first. 2 weeks passed, and Frank was hungry again. Not for food, but to quench those desires he had kept locked up for so long. He called an elderly relative of his, 80 years old, Angelina Ialegio. He wanted to recreate that feeling the first murder had given him, so he followed her to her kitchen, where he grabbed one of the knives and began stabbing her furiously. I don't think he would ever admit it, but I think that he was starting to enjoy the beast inside of him. He was starting to like giving it more control. After Frank had stabbed Angelina to death, he stole one of her rings and raped her dead body. Then a year passed. Frank kept on with his carpentry business and family life. But the day before Thanksgiving 1992, he had been employed by an elderly couple to do some carpentry work for them. It was Michael Krieger, 83 years old, and Betty Krieger, 78 years old. They were a security-conscious couple, so when they didn't turn up on the feast the next day, their son got worried, and so he called police to check on his elderly parents. When police gained entrance to the home, they stumbled upon a savage crime scene. Frank Masini had been invited the day before to do carpenter stuff, but at some point he had attacked the couple. He had stabbed Michael Krieger several times, and then he had focused his violence onto Betty. He had stabbed her too, and after he was done with the stabbing, he raped her dead corpse. But Frank was too impulsive. He was so desperate to keep the darkness away that when it actually broke out, he lost all control. It might sound cliché, but the mind is a powerful fucking thing. It's the engine that keeps us going, and in some people, the mind is polluted. It doesn't have anything to do with demons or spirits, it's just the fantasies, the taboo compulsions, the need to satisfy ourselves, to release those precious endorphins, to reach that uncontrollable climax, to tickle the G-spot in our head. Police quickly learned that Frank Masini had been at the residence the night before to do carpentry. There was no sign of forced entry, which placed him in the middle of the crime scene. He confessed to what he had done to the Kriegers and to what he had done to two of his elderly relatives the year before. But he never gave a reason or a motivation for what he had done. All he said was that he felt attached. I don't think he himself even really understood how it happened. What to some killers is a crafted and honed skill that they embrace, is to some others let out in an emotional explosion. It's like uncontrollable anger, but it comes with a purpose and a goal. He had begun his serial killings the day before Thanksgiving 1991, and he had ended them the day before Thanksgiving 1992. 1 year of murder. 4 elderly victims dead, and 3 of them had their bodies degraded by a middle-aged New Jersey carpenter. Frank Masini is still incarcerated. Now, before we end this episode of Double Feature, I'm going to tell you something. I made a promise to reveal the Halloween special in this episode, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. This year's Halloween special will be special in many ways. It's not a traditional Ages of Murder type episode. It's not about a killer or a victim. It's more about a place and the dark history that place has. So many young women have gone missing, and so many of them have been murdered on that road. Some of the murders have been solved, and some of them remains a mystery. I am of course talking about the Highway of Tears. I am right now in the most basic stage of research or constructing the thing, which means I'm writing down names, dates, status, and creating a timeline. I imagine that the episode will be more like a big one filled with smaller ones, if that makes sense. Because while some of them are connected to each other, some of them stand alone as isolated incidents. But I want to go through all of them. The missing, the murdered, and the unsolved. This Halloween is going to be very special. But before that, we have one more Ages of Murder episode coming up, and I think I'll do one more double feature as well. Then I'm gonna need a couple of weeks to create the Highway of Tears Halloween special, and that's where today's video ends. I hope you enjoyed tonight's double feature.